On a stretch of water barely 21 miles wide, a missile struck a tanker owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. It happened on a Saturday in the Strait of Hormuz, at the exact moment Iranian and Omani negotiators were telling reporters that talks over that same waterway were, in their words, approaching their final stages. That contradiction, a missile flying while diplomats were shaking hands over video calls, is where this story sits right now, in the second week of August 2026. And it is the reason Tehran's demand for compensation from Washington is no longer just a talking point on state television. It has become, according to Iran's own Supreme National Security Council, a non-negotiable condition for ending a war that started 5.5 months ago and has not, technically, finished yet. Let's go back further than the war itself, because the compensation fight only makes sense once you see how much diplomacy was tried and failed before a single missile was fired. Talks between Washington and Tehran had been running on and off since April of 2025. A first round opened at Al Alam Palace in Muscat, Oman, on April 12, 2025. And stretched with gaps until mid-June of that year. On the American side sat Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, alongside Director of Policy Planning Michael Anton, CENTCOM Commander Brad Cooper, and later Special Envoy Jared Kushner. On the Iranian side sat Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, Deputy Foreign Minister Majid Takht Ravanchi, and Ali Larijani, then Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. A second round opened in Geneva in February 2026 and ran for about 3 weeks. A third round began in late March 2026 and collapsed within 8 days. A final attempt, a set of direct talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, lasted a single day, April 11th into April 12th. None of it held. And crucially, several of the same Iranian officials who sat across that table in Oman and Geneva and Islamabad, including Larijani himself, were among those killed when the war began. That is not a minor detail. It means the war didn't just destroy infrastructure, it eliminated a chunk of Iran's own institutional memory of how to negotiate with Washington, which is part of why the current compensation talks are being run by a newer set of officials, including Araghchi, now operating without the negotiator who had led Iran's side for most of the prior year. It also helps explain the slow, uneven pace of the compensation talks themselves. Every round since February has effectively required Iran's side to rebuild working relationships and institutional trust from scratch, even while simultaneously trying to extract a specific dollar figure or its equivalent in sanctions relief from the same government whose strikes triggered that leadership vacuum in the first place. Now, to where this began, because you cannot understand what Iran is demanding today without understanding what happened to it first. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of large-scale strikes across Iranian territory. This was not a limited raid. It was, by most independent accounts, one of the most significant direct military campaigns against Iran in the history of the Islamic Republic. Among the targets hit in those opening hours were Iran's most senior leadership figures. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had ruled Iran since 1989, was killed. So was Ali Larijani, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, and one of the country's most experienced negotiators, a man who had spent years sitting across the table from American and European diplomats. In the space of a single operation, Iran lost both its ultimate religious political authority and its lead negotiator. Within days, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba Khamenei, was elevated to Supreme Leader, a transition that reshaped the chain of command in Tehran for everything that followed. The war that followed those opening strikes did not stay confined to a single front. Oil and gas facilities were hit. Petrochemical plants, steel plants, and aluminum factories, the industrial backbone Iran had built over decades under sanctions, were repeatedly targeted, according to Iranian officials speaking to Al Jazeera. Military complexes were struck, but so were bridges, ports, and railway networks. Universities and research centers were damaged. Power plants and water desalination plants, infrastructure that keeps ordinary Iranian cities running, were directly hit. Hospitals, schools, and civilian homes were also damaged or destroyed, according to the Iranian government's own accounting relayed through Al Jazeera's reporting from Tehran. None of these claims about damaged infrastructure have been independently verified line by outside auditors. And it's worth saying clearly, Iran is the source of most of these damage claims. But the broad pattern, that Iran's energy, transport, and industrial infrastructure absorbed heavy strikes over a period of weeks, is consistent across Al Jazeera, CNN, and other outlets covering the war from multiple angles. It's worth pausing on why the Strait of Hormuz keeps coming up in this story at all, because if you don't know its scale, the compensation fight over it won't make sense. It is a narrow channel, at its tightest point barely 21 miles across, separating Iran from Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through that gap on any given normal day, along with a significant share of global liquefied natural gas shipments. There is no practical alternative route for most of that cargo, And the handful of pipeline bypasses that do exist across Saudi Arabia and the UAE can absorb only a fraction of the volume that normally passes through the strait by sea. That single fact is the entire reason a missile strike on one tanker or explosions near one island can move Brent and West Texas intermediate crude prices within hours. And it's the same reason Iran keeps returning to the strait as leverage rather than just talking about frozen bank accounts. Controlling, taxing, or threatening traffic through Hormuz is, for Tehran, a far more immediate pressure point than any court case or diplomatic filing could ever be. By early April, exhaustion on both sides opened a narrow window. On April 7th, 2026, Iran and the United States announced a temporary 2-week ceasefire. It was fragile from the start, but it held long enough for something else to happen. Tehran began almost immediately to talk about money. On April 14th, 2026, Iran's envoy to the United Nations said publicly that 5 regional countries needed to pay compensation based on Tehran's accusation that those countries had allowed their territory to be used for launching strikes against Iran. That same week, Iranian government spokeswoman Fatemeh Mohajerani gave an interview to Russia's RIA Novosti, in which she said Iran's early estimate put direct and indirect war damages at roughly $270 billion. She did not offer a detailed breakdown of how that number was calculated, and no independent body has verified it. That matters, because $270 billion is not a small number to put into a script without a caveat. It is Iran's own early estimate, provided to a Russian state news agency, and it should be treated as exactly that. An opening claim, not an audited fact. Mohajerani made another point in that same period that rarely gets repeated in Western coverage. She said that Iran's existing economic realities meant the government did not currently have the resources to compensate its own civilians for destroyed homes, let alone rebuild everything at once. In other words, even as Tehran was demanding money from Washington and from regional neighbors, its own spokeswoman was acknowledging the state's cash position domestically was strained. Meanwhile, the secretary of the Association of Iranian Airlines, Maghsood Asadi Samani, told Iranian media that 60 civilian aircraft had been put out of commission during the war, with 20 of them destroyed outright by you. Hess and Israeli strikes, leaving Iran, by his account, with only around 160 passenger aircraft still operational. If accurate, that is a serious blow to a national airline fleet that was already aging and sanctions strained before the war even started. Here's where the idea of declaring victory comes in, and this is the part that requires real precision, because a lot of channels are going to get this wrong. On the 40th day since his father's death, Mojtaba Khamenei, now Iran's supreme leader, delivered a televised statement. He said Iran had, in his words, achieved a final victory in the war against Israel and the United States. He said Tehran had astonished the world over the course of the conflict. That is a direct claim from Iran's own head of state, reported by Al Jazeera on April 9th, 2026. But here's the distinction that matters. That is Iran declaring its own version of victory. It is not the same thing as the United States admitting defeat. Washington has issued no statement conceding loss, no formal acknowledgement of failure, nothing resembling surrender language. What we actually have, verified, is this. Iran's government says it won. The United States has not said it lost. Those are two different facts, and a responsible account of this story keeps them separate rather than blurring Iran claims victory into America admits defeat, because the second version simply has not happened. By May, the compensation demand moved from rhetoric into an actual written proposal. According to reporting carried by Iran's IRB state broadcaster and relayed by outlets tracking the negotiations, Tehran submitted a comprehensive plan to end the war that insisted on full compensation for war damages, the complete lifting of sanctions, the release of Iran's frozen assets held abroad, and recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. The counterproposal was delivered through Pakistani mediators and passed to Washington. President Trump's reaction came fast, and it came on his own platform. He posted that he had read the response from what he called Iran's so-called representatives, and said, in his own words, that it was totally unacceptable. His source, cited by Iran's Tasnim news agency, pushed back, saying Iranian officials were not seeking Washington's approval in the first place. That's a genuine standoff, captured in near real time, not a smoothed-over diplomatic summary. One side calling the offer unacceptable, the other side saying it never expected acceptance. Despite that public friction, something did move behind the scenes. Between May and June, the diplomatic channel itself is worth understanding, because these talks were not happening in a straight line between Washington and Tehran. They were running through intermediaries. Pakistan carried the May counterproposal to Washington. Qatar's emir was separately in contact with President Trump by phone, discussing ways to narrow the gap between the two sides, according to that country's foreign ministry. Oman, which had hosted the very first round of talks back in April 2025, remained central to the Strait of Hormuz track specifically, given its geography sitting directly across the water from Iran. This matters for the compensation story because it means Iran is not simply negotiating with one counterpart. It is running at least 3 parallel channels: a Pakistan-mediated track on the broader war-ending memorandum, a Qatar-mediated track on narrowing political differences, and an Oman-mediated track specifically on the Strait and shipping. And the compensation demand shows up in slightly different form inside every single one of them. That's part of why a single, clean, agreed compensation figure has been so difficult to produce. 3 separate mediators are each carrying a slightly different version of Iran's ask back to Washington. By June, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, Esmail Baghaei, confirmed that Iran and the United States were actively discussing compensation for war damage as part of their broader dialogue. Baghaei said one of the topics inside a 14-point memorandum of understanding under discussion was, specifically, preparing the conditions for compensation. He said there were various options on the table, including allocating a lump sum, and that if the broader memorandum was agreed, the 2 sides would then have a window of 30 to 60 days to hash out the details. Crucially, Baghaei also said Iran's nuclear program was not part of these particular discussions, that would only come after a memorandum on the general issues was locked in. According to reporting later carried by the Associated Press, that interim deal, signed in June, did include a schedule for winding down sanctions and a plan for addressing compensation as part of a final agreement, alongside the unresolved question of Iran's frozen assets abroad. Now let's bring this current, because the last 10 days have moved fast, and this is where the freshest verified information comes in. On August 3, 2026, President Trump told reporters this represented, in his words, the last chance for a deal, according to Al Jazeera's live coverage of that day. On August 4th, Qatar's foreign ministry told reporters that drafts of a potential agreement between the U.S. and Iran were being circulated and were, in their words, in very progressive stages, while carefully noting Doha did not currently have direct talks scheduled between the 2 sides. On that same day, CNN reported that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said there had been progress on a Strait of Hormuz arrangement, but, in his phrase, not finality. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent floated the idea that a consensus could be reached within a day or 2, but that optimism came with a harder edge attached to it. A senior Iranian military official, Mohsen Rezai, described as a military advisor to the supreme leader, said on Iranian state television that Tehran would not allow shipments through the Strait of Hormuz on any route other than Iran's own stipulated path, and warned that Hess warships traveling other routes would be targeted. That is not a diplomatic quote. That is a direct military threat delivered on state media, and it belongs in this story exactly as reported, without softening it. 2 days later, on August 5th, Axios reported operational details of a proposed 60-day interim mechanism for the strait. Inbound traffic would run through a northern lane inside Iranian territorial waters, outbound traffic through a southern lane in Omani waters, coordinated with Iran, with no tolls charged during that temporary window while both sides worked to clear naval mines from the median lane within 30 days. A Pakistani official told The National that indirect talks on this memorandum of understanding were at an advanced stage, focused specifically on reopening the strait and keeping it open. It sounded, for about 48 hours, like real momentum. Then came August 7th. Day 161 of the war, according to the ongoing daily tracker maintained by Global Security. Orgy. President Trump told reporters the war had, in his words, got to end pretty soon, and said he did not believe Iran can go much longer. At almost the same moment, Bloomberg reported that a draft Iran-Oman text, now sitting in front of Iran's own parliament, would bar U.S. and Israeli-linked ships from the Strait of Hormuz entirely, and would require compensation payments from what the draft calls hostile states, with the entire arrangement still requiring the unconfirmed personal assent of Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei before it becomes final. On that same day, explosions were heard on Qeshm Island near the strait's entrance. Iranian state media claimed it stemmed from a naval confrontation with what they called hostile enemy targets. Here's the contested part, and it needs to be said plainly. A Hormozgan provincial official publicly denied that account. As of this recording, that specific incident remains unresolved. One side in Iran's own government structure is disputing another side's version of what happened on its own coastline. Oil markets reacted regardless. West Texas Intermediate crude rose above $78 a barrel, and Brent crude climbed near 82, extending gains tied directly to the uncertainty around Qeshm. That same week, CNN reported something else worth flagging carefully because, if verified in full, it would be enormously significant. Sources familiar with the matter told CNN that the U.S. military had burned through nearly 80% of its interceptor stock for a key missile defense system, leaving what commanders described as a dangerously low munitions stockpile at the Pentagon. President Trump reportedly reacted with anger to reports that stockpiles of THAAD, Patriot, ATACMS, and PRSM systems had been depleted, and vowed to hunt down what he called treasonous leakers of that information. This claim comes from unnamed sources cited by CNN, not from an on-the-record Pentagon statement, so it sits in the same category as several other numbers in this story. Plausible, sourced to credible reporting, but not confirmed by an official on-camera announcement. It is included here because it is directly relevant to why Washington may be under real pressure to reach a deal quickly, not because it has been independently verified beyond CNN's sourcing. There's a wrinkle in that missile stockpile story worth spelling out because it changes how you should read Trump's public tone this month. If a major American missile defense system really is running low on interceptors, then his public statements that the war has got to end pretty soon and that Iran can't go much longer carry a different weight than pure confidence. They could reflect genuine pressure to close this out before either side's ability to sustain further exchanges is tested. That's an inference, not a confirmed fact, and it should be treated as analysis rather than reporting. A possible explanation for the timing, not a confirmed cause and effect relationship that any official on either side has actually stated on the record. But it's a reasonable read of the timing. The CNN stockpile story and Trump's pretty soon comment landed within roughly 24 hours of each other on the same day, August 7th. There's also a domestic Iranian angle that rarely makes it into Western coverage of this war, and it says something about how Tehran is managing the story internally. Around the same period, Iran marked what it calls Journalists' Day, an annual event commemorating a state media journalist killed nearly 3 decades ago in Afghanistan. CNN's live coverage noted the irony directly. Iran was marking a day honoring press freedom and journalists at the exact moment it ranked 177th out of 180 nations in Reporters Without Borders' 2026 World Press Freedom Index, near the very bottom of the list. That detail matters for one reason in particular. Almost everything Iran's government says about the war's damage, about compensation figures, about who fired first at Qeshm Island comes filtered through a state media apparatus operating in one of the most restricted press environments on Earth. That doesn't make Tehran's claims automatically false. But it is precisely why outlets like Al Jazeera, CNN, and the Associated Press consistently frame Iranian figures, the $270 billion damage estimate, the aircraft losses, the Qeshm confrontation, as claims attributed to Iranian officials, rather than as independently confirmed numbers. There's also a financial mechanism angle worth walking through slowly, because compensation can mean several very different things, and Iran has floated more than one version of it. The most concrete idea on the table is the Strait of Hormuz toll, a tax levied on foreign ships, particularly those linked to the United States or Israel, passing through the waterway, with the revenue treated as a form of ongoing compensation rather than a single lump sum payment. The second version is the frozen assets route, releasing Iranian funds held in foreign banks under sanctions, which Tehran counts as compensation even though technically it would just be Iran regaining access to money that was already its own. The third version, floated by Foreign Ministry spokesman Baghay in June, is a direct lump sum allocation, paid out on an agreed schedule once a broader memorandum of understanding is finalized. As of this recording, no single one of those 3 mechanisms has been formally agreed to by both sides. Iran's parliament is still reviewing the draft Oman text as of early August, and that draft itself still needs Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei's personal unconfirmed sign-off before any of these mechanisms becomes real. Then, on August 8th, the most recent update available, Iran targeted a vessel owned by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company in the Strait of Hormuz, according to CBS News, even as talks with Oman continued. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said that same day that negotiations with Oman were approaching the final stages, but he specifically cautioned that this should not be read as a sign the strait was actually about to reopen. Rezaei's earlier warning about targeting U.S. warships on unauthorized routes and the Qeshm Island explosions the day before both hung over that August 8th tanker strike. And together they explain why Araghchi paired his optimistic language about the talks with an unusually blunt caveat in the same breath. Iran's Supreme National Security Council issued what CBS News described as a list of highly unlikely demands that the United States would need to meet before the strait fully reopens. According to that list, the U.S. must never threaten Iran again, must end what Tehran calls a blockade, must withdraw all military assets from the region, must lift sanctions, must unfreeze Iranian assets held abroad, and must compensate Iran for war damages. Read that list back, and you'll notice something. Compensation is not a side issue anymore. It sits at the very end of Tehran's core list of conditions for ending this conflict, alongside troop withdrawal and sanctions relief, treated by Iran's own Security Council as being in the same category of importance as those far larger strategic demands. It's also worth explaining, in plain terms, why sanctions relief keeps getting bundled together with compensation in every one of these negotiating rounds, because to an outside viewer, they can look like 2 unrelated demands stapled together for leverage. Iran has lived under layered U.S. and international sanctions for well over a decade, covering its oil exports, its banking sector, and its access to foreign currency reserves. Those sanctions were already squeezing the government's cash position before a single missile fell in February 2026. So when Mohajerani said Tehran didn't currently have the resources to compensate its own civilians for destroyed homes, that wasn't purely a war damage statement. It reflected a state that had already been running tight on liquidity for years. From Tehran's point of view, lifting sanctions and securing war compensation aren't separate asks. They're two halves of the same request, which is simply, give us back access to money, whether that money is unfrozen, untaxed, or newly paid. That's also why Iran's May peace proposal bundled compensation, sanctions relief, and frozen asset release into a single document rather than three separate ones, and why the June memorandum did the same, treating them as one interconnected sanctions and compensation track rather than isolated issues. The regional picture around this also shifted on August 8th. Yemen's military carried out retaliatory strikes against the Houthi movement, an Iranian-backed proxy group, according to reporting from that day. Separately, tracking of the war's daily developments noted that Saudi Arabia was bracing for coordinated attacks from Iraqi militias and Houthi forces targeting ports, airports, and energy infrastructure. A sign that even as Tehran and Washington negotiate over compensation in the Strait of Hormuz, the broader regional conflict involving Iran's network of allied and proxy forces has not calmed down. This is important context because it complicates the Iran declares victory narrative even further. A government claiming final victory over a foreign power is, at the very same moment, managing active fighting on multiple fronts through allied militias across at least 3 countries. So where does that leave the actual claim in this story's headline? Iran has demanded compensation. That part is fully verified, repeatedly through its UN envoy, through a formal peace proposal in May, through a signed interim memorandum in June, and through its Supreme National Security Council's public conditions list as recently as August 8th. That demand is real, consistent, and growing more specific over time, from vague talk of compensation to a concrete idea of taxing ships through the Strait of Hormuz and to allocating a lump sum payment. What is not fully verified and should not be presented as settled fact is the idea that the United States has been defeated in any formal sense. What is verified is narrower and more precise. Iran's own supreme leader has publicly claimed victory. The United States has made no matching admission. The war itself, as of this recording, has not formally ended. There's a fragile framework, an interim memorandum, ongoing Hormuz negotiations, and a war that Trump himself says needs to end pretty soon, rather than a signed peace treaty with agreed compensation figures. Before closing, it's worth being explicit about the single title claim that started this video, because that's the standard this whole account has been trying to hold itself to. Iran declares U.S. defeat is not something any verified source, Iranian or American, has stated in those exact terms. What is verified is narrower. Iran's supreme leader has claimed final victory, and Iran is demanding compensation with real specificity and real leverage behind it. Those two facts are dramatic enough on their own without needing to be inflated into a formal American surrender that has not, in fact, happened. A few things in this story remain genuinely contested and deserve to be named directly rather than glossed over. Iran's $270 billion damage estimate, cited to RIA Novosti, has no public breakdown and has not been independently audited. The August 7th Qeshm Island incident is disputed even within Iran's own government structure, between state media and a provincial official. The claim that the U.S. has burned through 80% of key missile interceptor stocks comes from unnamed sources speaking to CNN, not from an official Pentagon statement. And Iran's own draft agreement with Oman over the Strait of Hormuz still requires the personal, unconfirmed assent of Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, meaning even the most concrete-sounding parts of this deal are not yet locked in as of today. Sourcing across this story includes Al Jazeera's ongoing coverage from Tehran, CNN's live reporting from Washington and the region, CBS News' daily war updates, Associated Press reporting on the June interim deal, Bloomberg and Axios reporting on the Hormuz negotiations, and Iran's own state broadcaster IRIB and the Tasnim and RIA Novosti news agencies for Tehran's official positions. It's worth stepping back one more time to size up what a figure like $270 billion actually represents, because numbers that large tend to wash over an audience without registering. For comparison, that is roughly on the scale of a mid-sized country's entire annual economic output. It is also, by any measure, a number Iran floated to a Russian state news agency during an active war, without a published methodology, without independent verification, and without input from any neutral damage assessment body. None of that means the real damage is small. Steel plants, aluminum smelters, port infrastructure, and desalination plants are expensive to rebuild by any accounting method, and outlets from Al Jazeera to CNN have independently documented strikes across Iran's energy and industrial sector throughout the war. But there's a meaningful difference between Iran suffered extensive, verified physical damage to its infrastructure, which multiple outlets have confirmed through their own reporting, and the damage is precisely $270 billion, which remains a single self-reported estimate from one side in an active negotiation. A responsible viewer should hold both of those facts at once rather than collapsing them into a single, tidy number. There's a final piece of context that deserves its own moment. What happens to the compensation demand if the Strait of Hormuz talks with Oman collapse entirely rather than reaching the finish line Araghchi described as approaching the final stages? If that happens, Iran loses its most immediate point of leverage, the ability to tax or restrict shipping through the world's most important oil choke point, and the compensation conversation likely reverts to the slower, less certain track of frozen assets and lump sum negotiations buried inside a broader sanctions memorandum. That would almost certainly stretch this story out for months, not weeks. Conversely, if Tehran's parliament ratifies the Oman draft and Mojtaba Khamenei gives his sign-off, Iran gets a working mechanism to generate ongoing revenue tied directly to the strait, arguably a stronger outcome for Tehran than any one-time payment from Washington, since it wouldn't depend on the U.S. Congress or Treasury ever agreeing to write a check at all. What we're watching, in real time, is a war that has not officially ended, being negotiated to a close through a series of overlapping tracks: sanctions relief, frozen assets, a Strait of Hormuz shipping mechanism, and a compensation figure that Tehran has never fully specified in public. Iran's leadership is telling its own people the war was won. Washington has never agreed with that framing, but it also, according to Trump's own words this month, wants the war over pretty soon. Somewhere between those two positions sits the actual number Iran will eventually accept, and whether Washington ever agrees to pay any part of it at all. Zoom out one more level, and there's a broader pattern worth naming, because it's easy to lose sight of it inside the day-by-day tracker of tanker strikes and parliamentary drafts. This is, in modern terms, an unusually public negotiation. Most war-ending compensation talks in history have happened almost entirely behind closed doors, with terms revealed only once a final treaty is signed, if they're revealed at all. This one is playing out near real-time, across Truth Social posts, state television interviews, foreign ministry press briefings, and live news trackers updated multiple times a day. Trump's totally unacceptable post in May, Rezai's warship warning in August, Mohajerani's admission about domestic cash constraints in April, none of that is the kind of language governments usually let slip during active compensation negotiations. Whether that openness is deliberate messaging aimed at each country's own domestic audience, or simply a function of a conflict that has drawn this much global media attention, is something analysts are still debating. But it does mean that, unusually for a story like this, much of what would normally stay confidential is instead sitting in plain sight, sourced and citable, for anyone following closely enough to piece it together. It's also worth being honest about what this means for anyone trying to predict the ending. Wars that conclude with formal signed compensation agreements are historically rare. Most conflicts end with informal understandings, partial sanctions relief, or compensation questions, left permanently unresolved and revisited by diplomats for decades afterward. Given that Iran's own parliament hasn't finished reviewing the Oman draft, that Khamenei's assent remains unconfirmed, and that missile strikes on tankers are still happening in the same week as final stage talk from Iran's own foreign minister, the realistic range of outcomes here is wide. It could end in a matter of days with a signed Hormuz mechanism. It could equally drag for months through the slower frozen assets and lump sum tracks if the Oman deal collapses. Anyone telling you with total confidence exactly how many billions Iran will ultimately receive, or exactly when, is speculating well beyond what the verified record currently supports. So here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. If Iran's own government cannot yet tell its own citizens exactly how much money it's asking for, or exactly how that money would even be paid, through a shipping tax, a frozen asset release, or a direct transfer, does a public compensation demand actually carry any real weight at the negotiating table? Or is it, for now, mostly a message aimed at an Iranian audience watching their own state television? What do you think happens first? A signed compensation figure or a full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz? Let me know where you land on that, and let me know which of Tehran's demands you think Washington is actually most likely to accept first. The shipping mechanism through Hormuz, the frozen assets, or a direct payment. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with the next update as soon as there's something confirmed worth reporting out of Tehran or Washington.